Hello everyone, and welcome to the 133rd episode of the Shaman's Way podcast with our amazing friend Kriket. I know the intro doesn't change very often, but I thought I would jump in and do a little bit of housekeeping in today's episode. Two things that I wanted to discuss. One is we are on track to release a new course in early March. Stick around to the end of the podcast to hear more about that one. And the second item on the list is if you are getting any value out of these podcasts and you would like to show appreciation to Kriket for all her hard work in providing this great resource to you, I would ask that you head over to your podcast listening tool of choice, be it iTunes or Spotify or anything on Android, and give us a quick rating and a thumbs up and a 5 stars. It really goes a long way in helping us get out there and reach more listeners and motivate us to keep this excellent resource going for you. We did also have a bit of a technical glitch on iTunes, and chances are, even if you've already done this, we may have lost your rating, and that's particular to iTunes. But any ratings or recommendations or forwarding it to others is a huge way to say thank you for us. All right, and of course, nobody came here to listen to me, so I will stop talking now, and let's get on with the episode.
Well, hello to my constant listener. Welcome back for part 2 of my journey to the drum. I told you I would share this part of the story, and I'm not going to let you down. To my semi-constant listener, if you feel like you're walking in halfway into a conversation, that is exactly what is happening. I have done a first recording of this podcast called My Journey to the Drum, and that was an exploration of the experiences that led me to a path to explore spirit in an alternative, or what then was considered to be an alternative form. To my brand new listeners, welcome. I hope you enjoy this part of my tale of sharing with you how the journey of shamanism captivated me. I'm not going to rely on my experiences to lead you through this. This is more of how I came to terms with what shamanism was going to become in my life and how I was going to interact and to manifest in a way and to really bring shamanism into a place in my life that could be explored in a different way. When I first started in with the circle and with shamanism, I went through the period of, I want it all now. So if you didn't understand that, it was, I want it all now. I looked high and low for absolutely anything I could find for recipes on how to do shamanism, how to do this and how to do that. And well, I have to tell you, in the early 90s, the bookshelves were fairly bare. Any type of shamanism or ceremonies or rituals or so on and so forth, it's a much different field of intellectual exploration or experiential than it was then. In my drive to really understand how I could bring shamanism into my life, the Daily Tools of Shamanism, new workshop on Shaman's Way, we are releasing it in early March. When I started looking for the Daily Tools of Shamanism, it was to create recipes for manifesting what I was experiencing in the internal journey world into the external world. What I found was that there was very few books written on anything to do with how-to. I really wanted to know everything absolutely right now. And because nothing was available, of course, that created a voracious appetite for absolutely anything that I could find. Because I was first introduced to shamanism through a Foundation for Shamanic Studies teacher, I was then introduced to Michael Harner's book, The Way of the Shaman. Now, I'm going to be brutally honest with you, and if I offend you, any of my listeners, I do kind of apologize, but sort of not really. I found The Way of the Shaman to me to be very boring, and I'll tell you why I found it very boring. Because it wasn't a how-to book. But what it did, even though I didn't finish reading the book, I read the parts that were exciting to me, the how-to he did it. It also opened my mind to the fact that shamanism was global. I never considered shamanism as being something that was local, even though I was raised and grew up in Cree territory, there was never any expression or discussion of medicine practices where I grew up. My introduction to shamanism from the universal mentality or the universal platform presented it on was appealing to me. What that did is created a great curiosity for me. And in my efforts to understand shamanism, because there wasn't anything that was available to me, the second book that I picked up was The Great Cosmic Mother, which was written by Monica Zhu and Barbara Moore. It was published in 1987, I think by Harper. Regardless, I'll have a link at the bottom on the website for you to explore further. What that really helped me to do, it opened my eyes to some of the matrilineal aspects of medicine and the practice of healing. I was finally able to put to rest my Christian structure, and it helped to release the codices written upon my brain by the Bible. So whether I believed all of the suppositions or the writings of Monica or the artwork of Barbara, I didn't necessarily want to stop there. From that exploration, I wanted to understand how shamanism affected us. Once being able to be released from the codices of the Christian Bible, somehow, I'm not sure how, but put into my path was Shaman, which was an international journal for shamanistic research. How I found it, I really don't know. But it is an international periodical for shamanistic studies. It publishes original articles on shamanism and also neighboring ideas. The language of it, fortunately for me, was in English because it is published in Hungary. It satisfied the beginnings of my curiosity on the global aspects of how this could be practiced. What is shamanism? And this is one of the first things I read when I received my issue 1, volume 1. And it is called this. I read this from the introductory remarks on the study of shamanism. The publication of this first international journal on shamanism is a sign that shamanic studies have come of age. As recently demonstrated, interest in shamanism dates back to the 17th century, when the first more comprehensive reports of this phenomena were written down. Analytical studies began to appear in the 18th century. 100 years later, in 1870, Sir John Lubbock specified shamanism as the 4th stage of the evolution of religion. At this stage, he maintained, the superior deities are far more powerful than man and of a different nature. Their place of abode is far away and accessible only to shamans. That, my dear listeners, is exactly something I was looking for. And here, at the very back of the same issue, is something that totally appealed to me. What I didn't know at that point, there were conferences held. So this is what I read in the very back of the book. A conference on shamanism as a religion, origin, reconstruction, and traditions was held during the week of August 15th to the 22nd, 1992, in Yakutsk, the capital city of the Independent Republic of Sakha. To my listeners, especially my constant listeners in Siberia and that area of the world, I apologize for butchering the pronunciation. So I read on. It was the first time that a conference was held in Siberia could be openly dedicated to shamanism. Over 100 research scholars and speakers from all over Russia participated, and it was particularly welcome addition to see representatives of small nations where shamanism had endured until recent time attend in large number. Some 40 foreign, and in brackets they write American, Canadian, Japanese, Korean, French, Finnish, and Hungarian, end bracket, scholars took part as well. My goodness, what an exciting thing to fall upon in the very early 90s. So now I knew that there was this incredible branch of study that was dedicated to something that I was on fire to learn about. And I really wanted to learn as much as possible so I could do as much as possible. You can tell now I was on the east part of the medicine wheel. You know, on the east part, we are young and we are full of illumination. Oh my word, there is shamanism. Now, what the fuck is shamanism and how do I find out what it is? So, here we are on this journey. And this was the second part of it, was finding this international research, scholars and ideas of practices in shamanism from all over the world, primarily in the Eurasian countries. It opened my mind in ways that I can't even tell you about. I think I've collected every single issue from the very first one published in 1993 until 2020. Maybe I don't have, anyway, doesn't matter. That's going to be a tangent. That was very important for me on my journey. I was able to read field observations and field research into what the shamans were doing. It left me less than satisfied. It didn't flesh out to me the hows and the whys. See, now I'm moving on the medicine wheel. Now my journey and my study is coming into the fire part, into integration, into expression. How do I understand what's going on? And that's when I discovered a journal called the Anthropology of Consciousness, and I devoured it. The Anthropology of Consciousness. What a brilliant path of study. And this really began to open up the language and the ideas that I had seen expressed through journey after journey, not only my own, but the journeys of the people who were in my circles. I was already teaching by this point in time. I was already caretaker of a drumming circle. So I was really desperately trying to keep ahead of whatever students I had at the time or people who were journeying with me, because in that time, I think we were all students. I just stepped forward as a leader. I didn't really need anyone to follow me, but it was really great that I had people in my basement to study with. The Anthropology of Consciousness helped me to understand how consciousness rose and grew in complexity. I wanted to understand how the role of the shaman then began into the role of the priest and the priestess. How then it became further into compartmentalizations of spirit. But in order for me to understand the full impact of shamanism, I had to flesh it out. It was one thing to read anthropological research journals, and explorations really opened my eyes to the practices in Japan, Siberia, Russia, Korea. Very fascinating ways of captivating the shamanic approach to reality. Then I really wanted to notice, and I really began to become deeply involved in determining and distinguishing consciousness through the journeys of the individuals that I drummed for. I wanted to understand how consciousness was growing through the individuals and how that could be expressed through their journeys. How did we begin to separate ourselves as human beings from the great consciousness, from that great spirit? How did we, as beings who were now separated from source, how did we begin to compartmentalize? How did we begin to put together the tools of shamanism? When did the drum come into play, and how many times does the drum come into play? What does the rattle mean to all these different cultures? How can I bring the rattles that I use in the circles? How can I bring that forward and understand it from a daily use perspective? I read about cultures that use water. So now I want to integrate water into it. So then that became a tool of shamanism. The using of different herbs in my smudges, that was something that just grew organically for me. And I wanted to understand how the blending of this and the blending of that. But that also comes with research. Comes with research of where is frankincense from? Where is myrrh from? What are these different plants? What is the sage that grows in Drumheller called? And by the way, I've never really actually figured that out. I just call it Drumheller sage. Just so you know. I sound all brainy sometimes, but I don't have all the answers for that, I assure you. So where am I going with this? In understanding that anthropology of consciousness, I began to look for ways to ground my experiences into real time. If I have 3 people in my circle journeying and all 3 independently come up with water, then I really want to understand what water is. Someone introduced me to Joseph Campbell. I don't remember who. And in another iteration, a growing circle, I went to my public library and I took out all 10 DVDs of Joseph Campbell being interviewed by Bill Moyers. That opened me up to an entire other language. And there were only so many journeys that I could do in a week or in a month or in a year in order to explore mythology. What does this boat mean to us? Now I started to have a language. Now I could understand how these things really grew through time. And then with that language, this archaeomythological language, but we've forgotten our archaeomythological language. We have forgotten our mythical language. When I had to understand the stories that were occurring within the journeys, when I had to understand what the implications of all of these symbols were, and I don't say I had to, myself, I was driven to understand this. By reading Joseph Campbell, I then wanted to bring it into a deeper understanding of consciousness. Then I started to read one of Joseph Campbell's best friends, Carl Jung. And when I got into the readings of Carl Jung, let me digress and be fully honest, when I got into the readings of people who had read Jung and then interpreted him, and then I could understand Jung, I could really see the archetypes come forward in the journeys. I could see the deep, rich symbolism that Jung talked about in the ever-evolving consciousness. I really, again, like I said earlier, I wanted to really take notice of how I could distinguish and determine consciousness through journeying. How could I take these new ways that I was bringing to the circle, and how could I ground these experiences in real time by bringing it back to the conscious state. Now I'm coming from the difference of shamanism into neo-shamanism. Neo-shamanism is that practice of shamanism for healing of self, where shamanism is that healing of practice of healing for the community or for the society. In bringing neo-shamanism to life in my drumming circle was when we really began as groups to cultivate an understanding of how we thought and how we interacted with the world around us. These were the building blocks that it became a journey to understand how I could bring this archaeomythological language back. This is the time when I discovered of an often left out but incredibly important female anthropologist, Maria Gimbutas. I found her work and her dedication to excavating the female as a representation of a spiritual holder and as a spiritual vessel to be very refreshing. She really opened my eyes to how I could see things from a different perspective and how I could interpret my journeys. How could I bring more of the how could I bring more of the mythological reality from an anthropological perspective, although that sounds a little bit confusing perhaps, but I wanted to combine these things because I wanted to understand even deeper the roots of shamanism, and not shamanism specifically practiced by a single culture, but what are the roots of the consciousness of shamanism? What became the roots of that which held so many cultures together, practicing similar ideologies, having very similar cosmologies? These were the things that I really needed to explore. I ran across a book by Michel Jamal called Shapeshifters, Shaman Women in Contemporary Society. This was a very good way for me to hear the words of other women who were practicing in the field of shamanism. And I was greatly influenced by their experiences, not really influenced necessarily by their paths. None of them that I read did I go, oh, whatever they're studying, I really need that. So I wasn't looking for a path. I was really attempting to cultivate how I could be the best vessel for spirit and the understanding of spirit for the humans who came into my circle, or the humans who came into my world, so that we could share in a contemporary understanding of spirit. David Peat wrote a really changing book for me called Blackfoot Physics. And that was a book that would combine metaphysics and philosophy, the nature of space and time, the connection between language, thought, and perception, mathematics and its relationship to time, the ultimate relationship or the ultimate nature of reality, if there is even an ultimate nature, the causality and interconnection. There were many realities or many aspects in this book that brought it together. What were the inner nature of animals? What was the powers of animation? What was the importance of maintaining a balanced energy? Bringing together different and sometimes what seem like at odds ideologies and practices. You've heard me talk about, especially you, my constant listener, ecstatic body postures. And I've dedicated podcasts to the ecstatic body posture as well as writings on the website. They were really an important part of understanding the work of Maria Gimbutas, the work of archaeology and anthropology, and how the differences are, and how do we interpret those messages, signs, and symbols that were left behind by our ancestors. When we no longer speak the language, when we don't have access to their own stories, that part of us that recognizes the appropriation of someone else's stories, and recognizing that there is a part of that in all of this that I'm doing. I recognize that I'm hand-picking different aspects. There wasn't an opportunity for me at that point in time to study shamanism from a tribal perspective or from a group perspective. If there had been, I likely would have followed that path. I know there are students who come to me, and when they work with me, because I don't really work with an extreme structure, they find that a challenge. But since in the last 10 years, 15 years, whatever, there have been different schools of shamanism that have been brought to North America and different parts of the world that do provide this step leads to this step leads to this ceremony, and this ceremony, once you get this, then you're going to have enough power to do that. And those are respectable and invaluable ways of practicing. They just weren't around when I started. From the experiential part of it to the intellectual part of it to the philosophical part of it, where then became the storyteller. The storyteller became the part of me that, how do I convey the lessons of my ancestors, the lessons of your ancestors, etc., etc.? Well, one of the ways I could do that was read stories from all over the world. Clarissa Pinkola Estes, the Joseph Campbell stories, the Michael Meade stories, just to name three that have influenced me. These are storytellers. Oh, Angeles Arians. How could I forget her? My goodness, she inspired me. There are many different people that I have turned to for their thoughts and their ideas to help me distill my own thoughts and ideas into an understandable package, so to speak, a conscious package. And from there, I could express that consciousness. So therefore, I could take the daily tools that I used or the daily practices that I used. And now I could really understand what was the strength of this. Ecstatic body postures, they were very important for me. So in understanding how Felicitas Goodman began her study of recognizing postures that were left behind in her own studies, and as an anthropologist, she would recognize the similar postures from the people of the west coast of Canada to the same people who were in the caves of northern Eurasia. So there are similarities, and in bringing forward those trance postures, at a time I'd already accumulated quite a lot of intellectual musings and different opinions. When I started to go into the postures, I again found another way to ground the reality or the experience into our consciousness. By practicing body postures, we're also able to access some incredible ancestral knowledge that I wouldn't have been able to access without having the tools that Felicitas Goodman and Belinda Gore brought forward in their experiential workbooks. The Woman in the Shaman's Body and Barbara Tedlock really helped to open up my mind. Barbara Tedlock, by the way, was also a friend of Joseph Campbell, and Barbara Tedlock used to be married to Stanislav Grof, and Stanislav Grof and Barbara Tedlock got married by Joseph Campbell in a very interesting Viking ceremony. I don't know if you ever know that, but as a trivia collector, useless trivia collector, sometimes I can wow or astound, although those are very large words, people with my little tidbits of information that don't mean a whole lot, but certainly are interesting. Animal Speak, very early on in my work, became a very important book for me to bring to not only my students, but also to bring an understanding for myself. There were animals that appeared in my journeys that I didn't see growing up in my Alberta world, in my Northern Canada world. When I first started working with lion, I didn't really know any of the attributes of lion. And here comes in Animal Speak in Ted Andrews' book. He brings certain ways of understanding the families of animals, understanding the natural habitat. I really connected with his writings for the very simple reason that it was important to me as a child to understand the natural habitat of the animals around me. And here was a book that really encouraged the people who were seeking power animals, spirit kin, to very first understand where those animals grew up, where they lived, how they survived in their own environment, what were their hunting skills, what were their hiding skills, and how do those animals maybe apply to you, or how do those animals really apply to the journey. In growing with shamanism, it was and has been a very personal upheaval and personal reconstitution. From the very beginnings of, I want it all. I want it all. Right now, right away, give it to me. I want to know how to do it. What does the ceremony look like? What does that do? What does the drum do? What does this do? I had all these questions, but I had absolutely no understanding. Fortunately, I was in a time where there were very few how-to books, so I really had to understand what was underneath my practice. What is underneath the spirit of fire? What is underneath the spirit of water? Those were the things that I really had to explore for myself. when I started to explore the little people, not the mushrooms, but the fairies, the gnomes, the brownies, those magical creatures that I didn't have any use for because they certainly seemed like so not shamanic. But then, again, ignorance falls away when it is suffused with information and knowledge. And I began to understand that there had been a long tradition with my ancestors in Finland, with my Sami people, that worked very closely with the elements of nature and worked very closely with the elves and with the gnomes and with the nature spirits that were abundant. So what I had dismissed out of hand in ignorance, when I opened my mind to intelligence, I could really see how the spirit world was communicating with me, but I was rejecting that part of the spirit world. In my rush to understand and do and do and do and do, really did feed that voracious part of me. For 10 years at least on the journey, I was a non-stop gatherer of information and knowledge, from this book to that article, from this person to that person, and being able to explore conversations in other platforms that were really rather new in the internet. So I was able to meet some people who had been practicing in different parts of the world their version of shamanism. So I was able to have some really interesting conversations and recognize that there were some very similar ways that we all practiced. There were similar ways of using the drum. There were similar ways of using water. There were similar ways of using fire. There were many interpretations of the medicine wheel. There's the sacred hoop. There is the bamboo hoop. There are many different ways of working with the medicine wheel. There were many different ways of exploring how the world could be interpreted in a mythological sense. And even though the journeys aren't mythological, they certainly do communicate with you in a mythological language, in a language that is abstract and removed from us. If we're not invested in understanding and relating to a world that is beautiful, wonderful, mystical, and has mystery. And it is the mystery that keeps myself coming back. It is the mystery that continues for me to research still other people's ideas, to read books on other people's way of practicing. Now, I know I've said this before, and I will say it again. I don't read a lot about other ways of doing things because I haven't even begun to understand shamanism. I haven't even begun to scratch the surface of what there is to know and understand. I talked about that in the daily practice, and I've talked about that before, about finding your own path and finding your own way. This is my vocation. This is my calling. This is who I am. I could no more walk away from shamanism than I could give up breathing. Not at this point in my life. The ability and the luxury and the privilege I have to practice what I love openly and honestly without being hunted by the police or stoned by my neighbors or fired from my job is a privilege and a luxury. Having the privilege and the luxury of having disposable income to buy the odd book here and there. Having the privilege and the luxury of living in a city with an amazing library. I would know nothing if it wasn't for my public library. I owe my understanding of the world and the foundations of even the word mytho-archaeological came from a source that I was able to find at the library. There are many ways that I am in deep gratitude for the way that shamanism has unfolded for me for the way that shamanism has influenced my life knowingly and unknowingly, the subtleties and the nuances. I hope you are driven by the subtleties and the nuances. I hope you do love the subtleties and the nuances. I hope you are able to engage the subtleties and the nuances and the tangible and the abstract and the experiential and the fuck-ups. We've all got to experience the fuck-ups. We all have to experience things falling flat. And the reason I say that isn't because I want to go gotcha. It's because it is a fundamental tool for learning. Learning to laugh at myself when I was in those 10 years of, I've got to understand everything now. When I landed in the South, they made so much fun of me for being so incredibly childish and to slowing down and to recognizing the embers of the fire and how long it took the fire to burn to create these great coals and embers, and that I had to understand the embers and how to reignite my consciousness. Once I got to the South, I really grew up in my practice. Well, before I go off on even more tangents, I'm going to stop now. And I'm going to say thank you to my constant listener. I know some of you have written and asked, when is it coming out? Or I'm looking forward to the second part. Thank you for your encouragement. It is a blessing for me. To my semi-constant listener, thank you for listening all this way through, and maybe you listened to the first part of my journey to the drum, or maybe you're curious and want to hear it now. And to my very brand new listener, if you have made it this far, congratulations and welcome to Shaman's Way. I hope that we have lit up a little bit of curiosity for you. I look forward to some of you joining me with the March 1st release of the Daily Tools of Shamanism, how some of these aspects that I talk about today have made their way into my life, and how I've been able to grow different understandings of the drum in this culture, the rattle in that culture, the divination here, ley lines there. So there are some really interesting things that may appeal to you. Until next time, sayonara.
Once again, thank you for joining us on this episode of the Shaman's Way podcast. For more information on the course, please do head to shamansway.net. There's going to be a large picture with the words upcoming workshop on the Daily Tools for Shamanism course, and you'll be able to sign up going there. There's also a new workshop coming through item on the main menu, so it should be very easy to find. Also, if you're already receiving our newsletter, you will see more details about it coming through there, as well as staying tuned here. Just a little bit about the format. Right now, it is looking to be about 6 hours worth of content. We are going to break this up into 2 roughly 3-hour sessions. They will be held a week apart. And so far, I believe we are looking to release them on Mondays. And then on Fridays, we're going to host a live session where you can ask questions. So ideally, throughout the week, you can get through the session, the 3-hour session, and then have an opportunity to ask questions or chat with others. And Kriket will host that session. Both the course and the live sessions will be available to you. So if you're not able to attend a live session, you will at least get the chance to hear what others are saying. And of course, if you do have questions that don't come up in the live session, or again, if you're unable to attend, you will be able to email us at any time. We have a contact form on the site, and we're happy to hear from you and answer any follow-up questions that might come about. That is everything I've got on the course at the moment, but we do look forward to getting this going, and we're excited to see how many folks jump in and join us on this new direction of the Shaman's Way site. I am positive we will have more to tell you in the next podcast episode as well, so I will stop here and simply